Okay, new apartment, new video. Are you excited? Yeah, he's excited. Yes, hello everyone, welcome to The Worldview. My name is Aaron Chandler Blake and this is Debunking Tartaria Part 2. If you're new here, first of all, welcome to the channel. I'm very glad to have you. And also, you might have missed episode 1. If you haven't watched episode 1 though, don't worry. The series has been designed in a very particular way which allows you to watch the episodes in whichever order you want. So if you want to go back and watch episode 1, that's fine, but don't feel like you have to in order to understand today's video. Like I mentioned, I do have a new apartment, so I apologise if I sound a bit echoey today and the audio is not great. I've only just moved in and I've not really worked out the best acoustics for it yet, or how to set the audio, so if it's a little bit echoey, I apologise. But in today's episode we are going to be looking at one of the big cornerstones of the Tartarian Empire, which is the mud flood theory. If you're not sure what the Tartarian Empire is, I'm going to give you a brief little breakdown now, but if you want a more detailed description I recommend you refer to episode 1. I will put a link to that video in the description. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Tartarian Empire was allegedly a massive empire that spawned most of the globe, originally starting in Far East Asia and North Asia before spreading to North America and also going into Europe and other places around the world too. So what makes this empire so special? Well, first of all, it apparently had hyper-advanced, ultra-modern technology. Some of this technology included healing bells that used a certain frequency. They also had sonic resonance devices that allowed them to levitate or liquefy objects at will. And apparently they also had airships centuries before we, according to our actual history timelines, achieved flight and aviation. And the second thing that makes the Tartarian Empire so special is the fact that they have been erased from our history books by the world elite, following a great reset and the mud flood, which are the things we will be discussing today. The reason they wiped Tartaria from history is because they wanted to hide the fact that the Tartarian Empire had such advanced technology. And they also did this as a way to control our historical narrative and therefore control the people of the world. However, in this video and the entire series, I will be proving that the Tartarian Empire is nothing more than an internet myth that stemmed from Russian nationalism in the 1970s and is a complete lie. So like I said, today is episode 2 and our main focus is going to be the mud flood and the idea of a great reset. If you don't know what those are, then here's a quick rundown for you. One main component of the Tartarian Empire conspiracy is the idea that there was this massive mud flood that wiped out the Tartarian Empire. Some evidence cited by theorists to support this includes architectural anomalies, subsurface architecture and a lack of construction records for a lot of old buildings we can still see today. Tartarians also believe in a Great Reset. It's unclear from my research whether Tartarians believed the mud flood was the Great Reset or both happened at around the same time, but the idea is the Great Reset was like a clean slate on society. Like all of our history was wiped away, all of our society was wiped away, and we pretty much had to start from square one. So a few of the things I mentioned there are more related to architecture, so I'll be covering them on the next episode. But for today, I want to focus solely and purely on the points that revolve around the mud flood and the idea of a Great Reset. Mainly, I want to focus on why a giant mud flood would be completely impossible under the conditions offered by Tartarian theorists. And I also want to have a look at some historical and geological records to prove that a mud flood in fact did not happen. Firstly, I want to look at where this mud could have come from, and also I want to look at the amount of mud you would need to pull off a mud flood of this scale. So to submerge only the major cities of the Tartarian Empire in around 3 meters of mud, you would need 15 billion cubic meters of mud. That's billion, with a B. So for context, the volume of the Great Pyramid of Giza is about 2.5 million cubic meters. So that is about 6,000 times less than the amount of mud we need to pull off this mud flood. Now, there are conflicting ideas within the community about whether this was one giant mud flood or if it was a series of multiple smaller mud floods that conveniently hit every single Tartarian city. Either way, there are a few explanations which have been offered. One of these is the idea that there was a series of volcanic super eruptions that left the cities of the world under the mud. Eruptions in places like Pompeii, Krakatoa and more recently Montserrat are referenced by theorists on how this would be possible. In theory, ashen volcanoes could be churned into mud if it mixes with the right elements such as rain or snow. However, there are no supervolcanoes near allegedly affected cities like St. Petersburg or in affected countries like Germany, France or Iran. Also, there is no geological evidence to support the idea that there was even one supervolcano eruption around the time of the mud flood or mud floods, let alone multiple supervolcano eruptions. Volcanic eruptions leave behind a ton of geological evidence, and to put it bluntly, the evidence needed to support a volcano-triggered mud flood just isn't there. And if you go down the route of saying it was just one giant flood that was caused by one volcano eruption, then there has not been a volcano eruption in the entire history of the Earth that would be strong enough to cause a mud flood of that scale, let alone one in the last 200 years or so. An eruption of this size would damn near end the world, and it would most certainly cause mass extinction. It would vaporise entire continents, it would cause mega tsunamis, and about 70% of all life on Earth would die. To be fair, these are similar conditions to what Tartarian theorists claim happened during the mud flood. However, the other effects of a volcano eruption of this size would completely eliminate the possibility of society being in the position where it is today if an eruption of that size only happened 200 to 250 years ago. For example, an eruption of this size would block out the sun, and temperatures on Earth would plummet by up to 20 degrees centigrade, which is worse than any ice age ever. And yes, I do include Ice Age 4 in that list. As for recovery time, you're looking at a few decades before life fully returns, up to a century before there's even partial climate change, and probably thousands of years before humanity can return to industrialization. For all of those points I just made, well, actually besides the industrialization one, we know they are true because 10 million megatons of force is the amount of force the meteorite that killed the dinosaurs hit the Earth with, and these are all consequences of that impact. In short, we know there wasn't an ultra mega supervolcano eruption 250 years ago because we aren't living in caves of sticks and stones and the world isn't an apocalyptic hellhole. Well, with exception to the current political climate anyway. And the reason I keep saying around the time the mud flood happened rather than saying an exact year is because theorists can't seem to agree on when the mud flood or mud floods actually happened, which if I'm being honest doesn't really do their cause many favours. Author Janine Helene claims that the mud flood happened in 1834. Then the website Stolen History claims it happens in 1840. And then author James W. Lee, who I'll be talking about a lot in the coming episodes, claims that the mud flood happened at least locally in 1862. So who do you believe? Other theories go down more speculative sci-fi based routes, with one theory suggesting that the world elite used some kind of Tartarian liquefaction device to purposely bury all of the Tartarian cities in mud. You're probably watching this and wondering where the evidence for this claim is. Well, guess what? So am I. If the world elite did manage to gain access to such a device, then why would they only cover the cities up to a certain level? Like, it took us so long to find Pompeii because the entire city was buried. If the tops of the buildings were still sticking out of the ground, I think we would have found it much sooner. Surely if you really did want to wipe this civilization from history, then you would leave absolutely no trace of them. And anyway, if the Tartarians were as widespread, dominant and technologically advanced as people would have us believe, then wouldn't that make them the elite of the world, not their opposition? Whatever, I digress. Some theorists suggest that there are so many Tartarian buildings left now because there were so many in the world that the elite couldn't possibly get rid of all of them. Some theories also suggest that Tartarian buildings are built too strong and too durable to be destroyed. Firstly, couldn't the world elite just use these Tartarian liquefaction devices to destroy the buildings instead of causing a mud flood? Surely that would have been much easier and much more efficient. And secondly, the amount of these allegedly Tartarian buildings that were destroyed in World War I, World War II and all the wars that have happened in between and since shows that they were in fact anything but indestructible. Thirdly, the idea that a world elite who are thorough enough to destroy a global empire and erase it from history would simply miss some buildings seems very unlikely to me. It also seems weird to me that theorists think destroying every Tartarian building would be impractical in some way, but a series of cataclysmic mudfloods spreading across the entire world is completely practical. Another theory is the idea that the mudfloods were not caused intentionally, and the world elite merely found the Tartarian buildings themselves and then they repurposed them into things like train stations, museums and places of worship. Because if I wanted to hide the existence of a hyper-advanced civilization, I would definitely turn all of their buildings into busy public spaces that thousands of people use every single day. I don't understand, like, if the world elite truly were this hell-bent on erasing every fibre of Tartaria's existence, then they would have done it. Surely, if they were as powerful as theorists would have us believe, then they would annihilate every scrap of evidence that suggests the Tartarian Empire existed, rather than just leaving it out in public, which would allow people to question it. There are a lot of cities around the world that have buildings which theorists would consider to be Tartarian, yet according to the same people, have not been affected in any reasonable way by the mudflood. All of this also doesn't factor in the geological evidence such as salt domes or inconsistent strata erosion, which completely debunks the idea of a cataclysmic mudflood that deposited literally millions of tons of sediment in one go. And if there was a mass extinction event just 200 years ago, then where are all the skeletons? We know there was a mass extinction event 66 million years ago because we found all the dinosaur bones in the same level in the ground, which shows they all died at the same time. Yet there is not a similar layer of skeletons and corpses much higher up from only 200 years ago. How do you explain that? Unless you're going to suggest that nobody died during this cataclysmic world-ending mudflood. Actually going to include this in the video originally, but I think it's quite interesting and it does tie in, so it's ended up making the final cut. Something that a lot of Tartarian theorists will talk about is the Alaskan boneyard. These areas have a high number of Ice Age bones in very high concentration. Reports of gold miners finding mountains of bones date back to the 19th century, but only recently have paleontologists started to fully excavate these sites. To the untrained eye, this could be seen as evidence that these animals are killed in one go by some giant unknown event. And this fire is only fueled by the amount of silt and mud these bones have been found in. Tartarian theorists, some of them at least, believe that this is evidence of a mudflood. The first thing I want to address is you may have seen some internet wives' tales about the Alaskan boneyard, saying that a lot of animals, particularly mammoths in this area, have been found fully preserved and upright with signs that they died of suffocation. This information is very cherry-picked and it lacks a lot of context. In some cases it's also very exaggerated as well. While it is true that mammoths and other mammals can be preserved in mud when they die, and they can also suffocate in these situations as well, the idea that we are finding entire herds of mammoths standing upright mid-stride with food in their mouths fully preserved is just not true. There are a handful of mammoths that have been found upright, but most of these are found in Siberia, not Alaska, and these discoveries are also far too uncommon to point to huge, sudden mudfloods as the cause. The most likely cause of mammoths dying like this include bog and mire traps. This is where the ground underneath the mammoth suddenly collapses, causing it to fall in and suffocate. Honestly, I think people are just jumping to conclusions when they say these very rare mammoth findings are evidence of a mudflood. Finding mammoths in mud doesn't necessarily prove there was a mud flood, the same way finding people in water doesn't prove there was a tsunami. The next thing I want to talk about is the fact that a lot of these bones come from Ice Age animals such as American lions and the previously mentioned mammoth, which both went extinct thousands of years ago, yet the mud flood only happened a few hundred years ago, so already this timeline is not adding up. A lot of the bones found in the Alaskan boneyard date back to the Ice Age, which ended around 12,000 years ago. However, some bones in the area can be dated back to 22,000 years ago, which shows that these bones have been accumulating in the area for over 10,000 years by the time the Ice Age actually ended, disproving the idea that all of these animals died in one go in, say, a mudflood, for example. Finally, the place where we find the bones is not necessarily the same place where the animals actually died. In fact, these high quantities of bones are found in very high concentrated areas due to a natural process called deposition. This process can happen in a number of liquids. It mostly happens in rivers, but it can also be a case for glaciers and ice as well. The energy and force of a river can change on a number of factors, and the low energy points of water flow are what we need to focus on here. When water has enough force, it can pick up particles such as mud, sand and small stones. However, when water gets really powerful, it can pick up quite big pieces of debris such as trees and in this case, bones. Low energy spots in water flows are where the power of the water is stopped or weakened in some way. This can be places such as floodplains, gravel bars or meanders. Because of this, the things being carried by the water are left behind or deposited in the low energy areas where water loses its ability to carry them any further. This is why you see sand and small stones collecting on the inside of a bend in a meander, and that's because the water doesn't have as much energy on the inside and it cannot carry these particles any further. The same rules apply to the Alaskan boneyard when we find all of these bones collected in the same area. This is because they were picked up by rivers in high energy places and then deposited into these low energy areas once they lost their power. And the argument that these bones couldn't have been moved as they were found in glaciers is not true, as glaciers do flow as well, albeit much slower than rivers, and they also leave behind deposition as well. And although permafrost itself doesn't flow, it can thaw out due to climate change, and this is becoming a lot more common in the modern era. Despite its name, permafrost is actually getting thawed out by rising temperatures around the world. Because of this, it is releasing bones into rivers as it gets eroded. Permafrost can also lead to the formation of talics, which are year-round unfrozen pieces of land surrounded by the permafrost. Closed talics will sometimes lead to the formation of bogs too, which are excellent for providing conditions of preservation due to the dense mud and low oxygen. The low oxygen environment prevents decomposition triggering bacteria from growing, and the lactic acid in the mud also preserves the soft tissue. A good example of this is the Tolland man, who was discovered in a peat bog in Denmark and was preserved there for over 2,000 years. So, does the Alaskan boneyard act as evidence of a mud flood? In short, not really. But I feel like the Alaskan boneyard is something that deserves its own video, so if that is something you'd be interested in, then please let me know in the comments and I can look at doing it at some point in the future. But now let's take a quick moment to talk about the Great Reset. The idea that all of world society was wiped clean by a cataclysmic event and we had to start from scratch. And for this, I want to reference back to someone I mentioned earlier, James W. Lee. In his book, The Old World Tartarians, James W. Lee makes a lot of very dubious claims. For example, he believed that the Mayans were actually black Moorish people. He thinks the United States had star forts until the 1850s, and oh yeah, he's a flat earther as well, which tells you everything you need to know about this man's legitimacy. But the main point of his from this book that I want to focus on today is the idea that there was a Great Reset from 1811 to 1812. Lee's evidence for a Great Reset is a sequence of earthquakes that struck Central and Midwest America in the early 19th century. The New Madrid earthquakes, as they were known, were a series of around 2,000 tremors, with three main quakes happening on the 16th of December 1811, the 23rd of January 1812 and the 7th of February also 1812. These are amongst the strongest earthquakes in US history, and the shockwaves are felt as far away as Washington DC. In this section, Lee also references Napoleon's Comet of 1811 and the Black Sun prophecy. So most of what I just mentioned is true. However, James Lee does tend to exaggerate the importance of these events. He also jumps to a lot of conclusions, and he doesn't really explain how all of this relates to a global Great Reset, as we will come to see. So, Napoleon's Comet became visible over America a few months before the New Madrid earthquake started, and Lee has this pretty vague insinuation that it was foretold in the Black Sun prophecy. You may not have heard of the Black Sun prophecy, so basically it is this idea that there is this ancient foreshadowing of a Armageddon-esque event that wipes out humanity, that has been passed through generations and civilizations throughout our history. However, this is not true. And in fact, the Black Sun prophecy isn't just one specific thing. It is an accumulation of different patchwork ideas that are slowly being rewritten and reinterpreted over several hundred years. So first of all, there are a few ancient civilizations that mention a black sun in different contexts and with different meanings. By the time we get to the medieval period, there is a bit of renewal in the interest of the black sun, and it is generally associated with the idea of transformation or a destructive regeneration. And this idea is outlined by Michael Maier's Atlanta Fugienne, which was published in 1617. By the early 19th century, specifically the 1810s, the various Black Sun writings were generally interpreted as meaning spiritual rebirth or some kind of mystical theology. It wasn't literally interpreted as an apocalypse or a great reset even at this time. And we know this because we can see it in the works by Franz von Baader, where he referenced the Black Sun as spiritual death in his lectures and writings. It wasn't until a man named Ignatius Donnelly published his book Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel in 1883 that we start seeing the Black Sun being associated with the apocalypse. And finally, by the 1930s, the Nazis adopted the image of the Black Sun to symbolise the idea of cosmic energy overseeing their Aryan dominance. So despite James W. Lee's insinuation that the Black Sun prophecy foreshadowed the apocalypse and therefore a great reset in 1812, the Black Sun prophecy wasn't actually associated with the apocalypse at the time. And as far as I can see, there's no references that would connect Napoleon's comet to the Black Sun prophecy anyway. So I'll be interested to know who James W. Lee referenced and cited in order to come to that conclusion. From what I can judge, his main reasoning seems to stem from the local name of the comet, Tecumseh's Comet, named after a native chief whose name translates as shooting star. But there is also no link between him and the Black Sun prophecy, so again, where's this idea coming from? The Hopi prophecy, I probably said that wrong, in native culture speaks of a great purification. It represents the end of the fourth world, which we're in now, and the beginning of the fifth world. But Tecumseh was a Shawnee leader, not a Hopi, so again, where is the connection? But a Tartarian theorist misrepresenting and ignoring people's ethnic histories, surely that would never happen. And even if these things were connected, how would a series of earthquakes localised entirely to the United States be a representation of a global Great Reset? James W. Lee also claims that no other earthquake has, and I quote, resulted in so much damage as the New Madrid earthquakes in world history. That's just not true. Not to downplay the New Madrid earthquakes, of course, they were absolutely devastating, and still to this day they rank as some of the worst earthquakes in American history. But to say that they were the absolute worst and most devastating earthquakes that have ever happened is just absolutely not true in any metric you look at. In terms of lives lost through primary and secondary effects, the Shanxi earthquake of 1556 was the worst, with death toll estimates reaching as high as 800,000, compared to the death toll in the New Madrid earthquakes of just 1,000. In terms of direct deaths alone, the Tangshan earthquake in 1976 was the worst. In terms of strength, the most damaging earthquake was the Valdivia quake in 1960 with a 9.5 magnitude compared to New Madrid's 8.1. And in terms of infrastructure loss, the most damaging earthquake was the Tohoku earthquake in 2011, which cost Japan $360 billion in damages. I know I've asked questions similar to this already, but who exactly is James W. Lee referencing when he says that the New Madrid earthquakes were the most damaging in world history? If you have to be so hyperbolic or so fluent with your interpretation of these facts, then is the point you're trying to make really worth making? No video about the Tartarian mudflood would be complete without addressing theorists' obsession with subterranean architecture. There seems to be this assumption within Tartarian theory circles that buildings with windows and doors below the current street level are smoking gun proof that a mudflood happened. However, there is a much more simple explanation for this process, as street level raising has been a very common practice throughout the Western world, and in some cases it can take centuries to reach the levels in the street that we see today. Older cities like Paris, Edinburgh, St. Petersburg and Rome have layers of previous infrastructure below the surface as new buildings and infrastructure were placed on top of them. Theorists also cite the fact that a lot of very old, heavily urbanised cities in the world have a much higher ground level compared to their surrounding areas. In some cases this is true, but it's not true for the reasons they would have you believe. In cases, cities raise their street levels due to flooding from local rivers, or in other cases, in cities such as London and Venice, they raise their street level because they're originally built on boggy marshland or heavily waterlogged areas. Street level raising is a very common practice throughout the Western world and has been for centuries. This is a fact that a lot of Tartarian theorists either don't know or refuse to acknowledge. For example, Prague in Czech Republic has raised its street level several times over the last few centuries, from the Middle Ages right up to the start of the 19th century. This is because it was continuously flooded by the local Vltava river. If you want evidence of this, you can go to the basements of buildings in Prague Old Town and actually see the different layers of the streets from over the years. This completely contradicts the idea that the street level was raised in one go by, say, a mud flood. Another example can be found in the city of Canterbury in the UK, which has raised its street level several times over the course of around 2,000 years. When the Romans occupied Canterbury from the 1st to the 4th century, they had a grid format for the streets, and it was raised in certain places to help with drainage and sewage. After the collapse of Roman control in England, the Anglo-Saxons didn't do a great job of maintaining the city. This led to mud and debris slowly building up in the streets, which naturally raised them. Human waste and rubble from new building projects also contributed to the raising of the street, as we can see in recent archaeological findings. Some roads in the city became so built up with waste and debris that instead of cleaning them, the Anglo-Saxons simply built a new road on top of it, which is why we have several layers throughout the years. An example of this can be seen in some of the older roads that surround Canterbury Cathedral. Then, an increase in foot traffic due to pilgrimage in the 12th to 15th centuries led to more debris, more human waste, more repairs, and more new layers being added. By the time the mud flood allegedly happened in the 19th century, Canterbury's Roman history was already 3 meters underground. Many of the Roman artifacts that have been excavated in the city can be found in the Canterbury Roman Museum, which is actually built down onto the original Roman street level. And one of the artifacts on display includes an original Roman floor mosaic, which has actually been warped out of shape by the passage of time and the movement of the ground. On a side note, the Canterbury Roman Museum is actually pretty interesting. If you ever find yourself in southeast England, it's definitely worth checking out. Coming back to the original point though, everything I just mentioned contradicts the idea that sediment was suddenly deposited into these cities in one go by a giant mud flood, and in fact shows that the city level and the street level was raised slowly over several centuries. We also need to acknowledge the amount of dust that falls from the atmosphere every single day. Tens of thousands of tons of dust falls to Earth's surface every day. That may sound like a lot, but given the total mass of the planet, it doesn't really show that much of a difference on a day-to-day basis. But this atmospheric dust that falls to the surface can become noticeable in unkempt urban areas over several years. Dust and other particles caught in the wind will naturally accumulate around obstructions in their path, which is why when it snows you'll see that the snow is normally a little bit deeper at the bottom of fence posts compared to the area around it. This process is also used to make artificial sand dunes. They will put fences and mesh wire on a beach, and over time the sand particles will get caught against the fence, caught against the mesh wire, and then evidently caught against the other sand particles. They will then build up into a mound and a sand dune, and that acts as a form of coastal defence. An example of this can be found at Cambersands Beach in East Sussex, England. This also explains why the Sphinx was buried in sand when Europeans found it, and it also goes some of the way to explain why certain urban areas are more elevated than surrounding rural places. Not to mention the fact that some cities and structures were built at higher elevations for defensive purposes, like we can see with Durham Castle in the UK and Marangar Fort in India. Mud, when compacted and given enough time, will turn into clay and eventually other sedimentary rocks such as shale. A lot of the shale we use for fuel today formed in the Paleozoic era between 540 and 250 million years ago. Eurasia, particularly in the Tartarian regions, is a vast mix of mainly sedimentary and metamorphic rock, with the latter of those two being formed when pre-existing rock is changed by factors such as chemical processes, high pressure or heat. For example, limestone can turn into marble if it's given the right conditions and sufficient time. The large amount of shale in the Eurasian Plate shows that there is a high presence of sedimentary rock which could have formed from mud. However, it cannot be a source of the mud flood given the time frame offered by Tartarian theorists. This is because sedimentary rocks such as shale need thousands or potentially millions of years to form. Okay, admittedly, this doesn't disprove the mud flood, but what it does do is it shows us that shale and the presence of other sedimentary rocks in Eurasia can't be used as proof to support the presence of a mud flood. The main geology point that does disprove the mud flood though comes from igneous or volcanic rock, most specifically to this video, basalt. For context, basalt is a volcanic rock that forms exclusively on the Earth's surface when lava is rapidly cooled by the atmosphere. Because of this, basalt is largely present in current or dormant volcanic regions or constructive tectonic plate margins, with many of these appearing within the Tartarian territories. So if there was a mud flood that destroyed Tartaria, we would not see any surface level basalt flows within the Tartarian regions. Yet Kazakhstan and Mongolia have an abundance of basalt flows still on the surface thanks to prehistoric volcanic activity. These flows are still present on the surface, and some of them are hundreds of thousands of years old, proving that a much more recent mud flood could not have happened in these areas. Other allegedly former Tartarian territories such as the Siberian Traps and other Central Asian countries also have basalt flows still on their surface. The counter-argument to this will probably argue that these places were sparsely populated or not populated at all, so the world elite didn't bother flooding it with mud. That is on the assumption that the mud flood was intentional, of course. However, there are places such as the Columbia River in the United States which show basalt flows on the surface, while others can be found in Iran, Turkey and Syria, which have historically had high population areas and are home to some of the world's oldest known civilizations. So to conclude this particular point, the presence of these prehistoric basalt flows on the surface of the Earth prove without any shadow of a doubt that a giant mud flood or multiple giant mud floods did not happen just a few centuries ago, as if they did happen, these basalt flows would not be on the surface anymore. The very small percentage of Tartarian conspiracy theorists who have actually addressed the geological challenges of the mud flood theory instead of just ignoring it tend to have pretty left field explanations, and I'm going to list a couple of my favourites for you now. Some claim these basalt flows were artificially constructed by the world elite as a way to cover up their tracks and the mud flood. Yet the method of basalt dating was not developed until the 1950s. So how did the world elite in the mid-19th century know that this is something they needed to cover up? It would be like a criminal from the 15th century wearing fake fingerprints. Also, if the original basalt got covered by the mud, then why not just leave it buried? It's not like anyone's going to know it's there, are they? It's not like rural Kazakhstan is a place where a lot of people go looking for a long-lost, forgotten, ancient, super advanced civilization, is it? And we know that because people don't do that. How on earth did I just manage to say all of that on the first take? Plus, why would the elite go through so many extra steps like making fake basalt flows when the initial mud flood or mud floods would have already taken so much orchestrating and effort? And clearly all of those extra steps wouldn't have been worth it anyway, as the Tartarian conspiracy theory still exists regardless. Other theories suggest that these scientific dating methods such as potassium-argon dating are in fact faked. And anyone who even has the simplest and most basic understanding of scientific methodology will know that is a complete load of rubbish. In some cases, these dating methods take decades to perfect and are studied by dozens of scientists from several institutions. Why would all of them conspire for the sake of covering up a Tartarian empire? And again, why would they bother going through all those extra steps, and apparently the University of Facebook has all the answers you need anyway. But even if we disregard all of that for now and focus purely on the topsoil that we can find in the Eurasian continent, that too disproves this idea of a mudflood. The inconsistency of soil type, quality and acidity across former Tartarian regions shows us that these soils came from different sources and not one common source like we would see from a giant mudflood. If the soil from cities such as Paris and St. Petersburg all came from one mudflood, then surely they would have a lot more qualities in common, but they don't. So the lack of geological and archaeological records, plus the presence of basalt flows, all disprove the idea of local floods. Meanwhile, the differences in topsoil in Eurasia disprove the idea of one giant mudflood, so any possibility of a mudflood is completely off the table at this stage. Every single time there is a government cover-up that requires support from other fields, there is always at least one person that blows the whistle on it. And yet the Tartarian theory requires collaboration from multiple different fields, such as geology, architecture, archaeology, scientific dating, and so many more areas, yet as far as I know, not one single person from any one of those fields has come forward to whistleblow the Tartarian Empire with solid evidence. Why is that? If there is a whistleblower for the Tartarian Empire who has legitimate background in any of these fields, then do please let me know in the comments. And you cannot use the excuse that people are scared to come forward, because we had whistleblowers for the JFK assassination, despite the fact witnesses are dropping down like flies from 1964 right up to Jim Garrison versus Clay Shore. And for such a big cornerstone in the Tartarian theory, there are still so many questions that theorists have left unanswered. Tartarians cannot tell us whether this is one giant flood or a series of smaller floods which conveniently happen to hit only the Tartarian cities all over the world. They cannot tell us the source of this mud. They cannot tell us where the volume of that mud came from. They cannot tell us where the volume of that mud went. There is also absolutely no proof of a Great Reset, and they cannot tell us for certain the date of the mud flood or any of the smaller mud floods that allegedly happened. So that is the end of episode 2 in Debunking Tartaria. Thank you very much for watching, and if you have made it this far, I feel like I've more than earned a like and a subscribe. Like I said at the end of the first episode, I'm very early into my YouTube career, I guess you can call it, so any support you can offer me at this stage really will make a big difference to me. And I just want to say thank you so much to all of the people that have supported the channel up to this point. Like, I cannot believe that we're already at 100 subscribers. It's actually fantastic. My first attempt at social media, it took me about a year to get 100 followers on my first page. So the fact we got to 100 followers in a little under 2 months this time is absolutely mind-blowing. And I know 100 doesn't sound like a lot in the grand scheme of things, it's not a lot. But to be honest, that's already more than I was ever expecting to get. So thank you very much for tuning in and continuing to tune in. And on that note, before I get too soppy, I would like to wrap things up. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I will see you for episode 3.